This audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's The Discovery of India, first published in 1946, is brought to you by Giribala Joshi. This short YouTube podcast is a part of a larger project. Please subscribe to the channel and like and share my videos. This series is created with the help of advanced text-to-speech AI technology.
Chapter 5, Through the Ages. Part 9, Vitality and Persistence of Sanskrit. Sanskrit is a language amazingly rich, efflorescent, full of luxuriant growth of all kinds, and yet precise and strictly keeping within the framework of grammar, which Panini laid down 2,600 years ago. It spread out, added to its richness, became fuller and more ornate, but always it stuck to its original roots. In the years of the decline of Sanskrit literature, it lost some of its power and simplicity of style and became involved in highly complex forms and elaborate similes and metaphors. The grammatical rule which enable words to be joined together became in the hands of the epigones a mere device to show off their cleverness by combining whole strings of words running into many lines. Sir William Jones observed as long ago as 1784, the Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both of them a stronger affinity, both in the roots of verbs, and in the forms of grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident, so strong indeed, that no philologer could examine them all without believing them to have sprung from some common source which perhaps no longer exists. William Jones was followed by many other European scholars, English, French, German, and others, who studied Sanskrit and laid the foundations of a new science, comparative philology. German scholarship forged ahead in this new domain, and it is to these German scholars of the 19th century that the greatest credit must go for research in Sanskrit. Practically every German university had a Sanskrit department, with one or two professors in charge of it. Indian scholarship, which was considerable, was of the old style, uncritical and seldom acquainted with foreign classical languages, except Arabic and Persian. A new type of scholarship arose in India under European inspiration, and many Indians went to Europe, usually to Germany, to train themselves in the new methods of research in critical and comparative study. These Indians had an advantage over the Europeans, and yet there was a disadvantage also. The disadvantage was due to certain preconceived notions, inherited beliefs and tradition, which came in the way of dispassionate criticism. The advantage, and it was great, was the capacity to enter into the spirit of the writing, to picture the environment in which it grew and thus to be more in tune with it. A language is something infinitely greater than grammar and philology. It is the poetic testament of the genius of a race and a culture, and the living embodiment of the thoughts and fancies that have molded them. Words change their meanings from age to age, and old ideas transform themselves into new, often keeping their old attire. It is difficult to capture the meaning, much less the spirit, of an old word or phrase. Some kind of a romantic and poetical approach is necessary if we are to have a glimpse into that old meaning and into the minds of those who used the language in former days. The richer and more abundant the language, the greater the difficulty. Sanskrit, like other classical languages, is full of words which have not only poetic beauty but a deep significance, a host of associated ideas, which cannot be translated into a language foreign in spirit and outlook. Even its grammar, its philosophy, have a strong poetic content. One of its old dictionaries is in poetic form. It is no easy matter, even for those of us who have studied Sanskrit, to enter into the spirit of this ancient tongue and to live again in its world of long ago. Yet we may do so to a small extent, for we are the inheritors of old traditions and that old world still clings to our fancies. Our modern languages in India are children of Sanskrit, and to it owe most of their vocabulary and their forms of expression. Many rich and significant words in Sanskrit poetry and philosophy, untranslatable in foreign languages, are still living parts of our popular languages. And Sanskrit itself, though long dead as a language of the people, has still an astonishing vitality. But for foreigners, however learned, the difficulties become greater. Unfortunately, scholars and learned men are seldom poets, and it is the scholar-poet who is required to interpret a language. From these scholars we usually get, as M. Barth has pointed out, traductions infidèles à force d'être littérales. So while the study of comparative philology has progressed and much research work has been done in Sanskrit, it is rather barren and sterile from the point of view of a poetic and romantic approach to this language. There is hardly any translation in English or any other foreign language from the Sanskrit which can be called worthy of or just to the original. Both Indians and foreigners have failed in this work for different reasons. That is a great pity, and the world misses something that is full of beauty and imagination and deep thinking, something that is not merely the heritage of India but should be the heritage of the human race. The hard discipline, reverent approach, and insight of the English translation of the authorized version of the Bible not only produced a noble book, but gave to the English language strength and dignity. Generations of European scholars and poets have labored lovingly over Greek and Latin classics and produced fine translations in various European languages. And so even common folk can share to some extent in those cultures and, in their drab lives, have glimpses of truth and loveliness. Unfortunately, this work has yet to be done with the Sanskrit classics. When it will be done, or whether it will be done at all, I do not know. Our scholars grow in numbers and grow in scholarship, and we have our poets too, but between the two there is a wide and ever-growing gap. Our creative tendencies are turned in a different direction, and the many demands that the world of today makes upon us hardly give us time for the leisured study of the classics. Especially in India, we have to look another way and make up for long-lost time. We have been too much immersed in the classics in the past, and because we lost our own creative instincts, we cease to be inspired even by those classics which we claim to cherish so much. Translations, I suppose, from the Indian classics will continue to appear, and scholars will see to it that the Sanskrit words and names are properly spelt and have all the necessary diacritical marks, and that there are plenty of notes and explanations and comparisons. There will be everything, in fact, literally and conscientiously rendered, only the living spirit will be missing. What was a thing of life and joy, so lovely and musical and full of imaginative daring, will become old and flat and stale, with neither youth nor beauty, but with only the dust of the scholar's study and the smell of midnight oil. For how long Sanskrit has been a dead language, in the sense of not being popularly spoken, I do not know. Even in the days of Kalidasa it was not the people's language, though it was the language of educated people throughout India. So it continued for centuries, and even spread to the Indian colonies in Southeast Asia and Central Asia. There are records of regular Sanskrit recitations, and possibly plays also. In Cambodia in the 7th century AC, Sanskrit is still used for some ceremonial purposes in Thailand, Siam. In India the vitality of Sanskrit has been amazing. When the Afghan rulers had established themselves on the throne of Delhi, about the beginning of the 13th century, Persian became the court language over the greater part of India and, gradually, many educated people took to it in preference to Sanskrit. The popular languages also grew and developed literary forms. Yet in spite of all this, Sanskrit continued, though it declined in quality. Speaking at the Oriental Conference held in 1937 at Trivandrum, over which he presided, Dr. F. F. Thomas pointed out what a great unifying force Sanskrit had been in India and how widespread its use still was. He actually suggested that a simple form of Sanskrit, a kind of basic Sanskrit, should be encouraged as a common all-India language today. He quoted, agreeing with him, what Max Muller had said previously: such is the marvelous continuity between the past and the present in India, that in spite of repeated social convulsions, religious reforms, and foreign invasions, Sanskrit may be said to be still the only language spoken over the whole extent of that vast country. Even at the present moment, after a century of English rule and English teaching, I believe that Sanskrit is more widely understood in India than Latin was in Europe at the time of Dante. I have no idea of the number of people who understood Latin in the Europe of Dante's time, nor do I know how many understand Sanskrit in India today, but the number of these latter is still large, especially in the south. Simple spoken Sanskrit is not very difficult to follow for those who know well any of the present-day Indo-Aryan languages: Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, Gujarati, etc. Even present-day Urdu, itself wholly an Indo-Aryan language, probably contains 80% words derived from Sanskrit. It is often difficult to say whether a word has come from Persian or Sanskrit, as the root words in both these languages are alike. Curiously enough, the Dravidian languages of the south, though entirely different in origin, have borrowed and adopted such masses of words from the Sanskrit that nearly half their vocabulary is very nearly allied to Sanskrit. Books in Sanskrit on a variety of subjects, including dramatic works, continue to be written throughout the medieval period and right up to modern times. Indeed, such books still appear from time to time, and so do Sanskrit magazines. The standard is not high and they do not add anything of value to Sanskrit literature. But the surprising thing is that this hold of Sanskrit should continue in this way throughout this long period. Sometimes public gatherings are still addressed in Sanskrit, though naturally the audiences are more or less select. This continuing use of Sanskrit has undoubtedly prevented the normal growth of the modern Indian languages. The educated intellectuals looked upon them as vulgar tongues not suited to any creative or learned work, which was written in Sanskrit, or later not infrequently in Persian. In spite of this handicap, the great provincial languages gradually took shape in the course of centuries, developed literary forms, and built up their literatures. It is interesting to note that in modern Thailand, when the need arose for new technical, scientific, and governmental terms, many of these were adapted from Sanskrit. The ancient Indians attached a great deal of importance to sound, and hence their writing, poetry or prose, had a rhythmic and musical quality. Special efforts were made to ensure the correct enunciation of words, and elaborate rules were laid down for this purpose. This became all the more necessary as, in the old days, teaching was oral, and whole books were committed to memory and thus handed down from generation to generation. The significance attached to the sound of words led to attempts to coordinate the sense with the sound, resulting sometimes in delightful combinations, and at other times in crude and artificial mixtures. E.H. Johnston has written about this. The classical poets of India have a sensitiveness to variations of sound, to which the literature of other countries afford few parallels, and their delicate combinations are a source of never-failing joy. Some of them, however, are inclined to attempt to match the sense with the sound in a way that is decidedly lacking in subtlety, and they have perpetrated real atrocities in the manufacture of verses with a limited number of consonants or even only one. From E. H. Johnston's translation of Ashvaghosh's Buddh Charita, published in Lahore, 1936. End of footnote. Recitations from the Vedas, even in the present day, are done according to the precise rules for enunciation laid down in ancient times. The modern Indian languages descended from the Sanskrit, and therefore called Indo-Aryan languages, are Hindi-Urdu, Bengali, Marathi, Gujarati, Oriya, Assamese, Rajasthani, a variation of Hindi, Punjabi, Sindhi, Pashto, and Kashmiri. The Dravidian languages are Tamil, Telugu, Kannarese, and Malayalam. These 15 languages cover the whole of India, and of these, Hindi, with its variation Urdu, is far the most widespread and is understood even where it is not spoken. Apart from these, there are only some dialects and some undeveloped languages spoken, in very limited areas, by some backward hill and forest tribes. The oft-repeated story of India having 500 or more languages is a fiction of the mind of the philologist and the census commissioner who notes down every variation in dialect and every petty hill tongue on the Assam-Bengal frontier with Burma as a separate language, although sometimes it is spoken only by a few hundred or a few thousand persons. Most of these so-called hundreds of languages are confined to this eastern frontier of India and to the eastern border tracts of Burma. According to the method adopted by census commissioners, Europe has hundreds of languages and Germany was, I think, listed as having about 60. The real language question in India has nothing to do with this variety. It is practically confined to Hindi-Urdu, one language with 2 literary forms and 2 scripts. As spoken there is hardly any difference, as written, especially in literary style, the gap widens. Attempts have been, and are being, made to lessen this gap and develop a common form, which is usually styled Hindustani. This is developing into a common language understood all over India. Pashto, one of the Indo-Aryan languages derived from Sanskrit, is the popular language in the northwest frontier province as well as in Afghanistan. It has been influenced, more than any of our other languages, by Persian. This frontier area has in the past produced a succession of brilliant thinkers, scholars, and grammarians in Sanskrit. The language of Ceylon is Sinhalese. This is also an Indo-Aryan language derived directly from Sanskrit. The Sinhalese people have not only got their religion, Buddhism, from India, but are racially and linguistically akin to Indians. Sanskrit, it is now well recognized, is allied to the European classical and modern languages. Even the Slavonic languages have many common forms and roots with Sanskrit. The nearest approach to Sanskrit in Europe is made by the Lithuanian language. End of Part 9, titled, Vitality and Persistence of Sanskrit, of Chapter 5. Part 10, Buddhist Philosophy. Buddha, it is said, used the popular language of the area he lived in, which was a Prakrit, a derivative of Sanskrit. He must have known Sanskrit, of course, but he preferred to speak in the popular tongue so as to reach the people. From this Prakrit developed the Pali language of the early Buddhist scriptures. Buddha's dialogues and other accounts and discussions were recorded in Pali long after his death, and these form the basis of Buddhism in Ceylon, Burma, and Siam, where the Hinayana form of Buddhism prevails. Some hundreds of years after Buddha, there was a revival of Sanskrit in India, and Buddhist scholars wrote their philosophical and other works in Sanskrit. Ashvaghosha's writings and plays, the earliest plays we have, which are meant to be propaganda for Buddhism, are in Sanskrit. These Sanskrit writings of Buddhist scholars in India went to China, Japan, Tibet, and Central Asia, where the Mahayana form of Buddhism prevailed. The age which gave birth to the Buddha had been one of tremendous mental ferment and philosophic inquiry in India. And not in India only, for that was the age of Lao Tse and Confucius, of Zoroaster and Pythagoras. In India it gave rise to materialism as well as to the Bhagavad Gita, to Buddhism and Jainism, and to many other currents of thought which were subsequently to consolidate themselves in the various systems of Indian philosophy. There were different strata of thought, one leading to another, and sometimes overlapping each other. Different schools of philosophy developed side by side with Buddhism, and Buddhism itself had schisms leading to the formation of different schools of thought. The philosophic spirit gradually declined, giving place to scholasticism and polemical controversy. Buddha had repeatedly warned his people against learned controversy over metaphysical problems. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, he is reported to have said. Truth was to be found in life itself and not in argument about matters outside the scope of life and therefore beyond the ken of the human intellect. He emphasized the ethical aspects of life and evidently felt that these suffered and were neglected because of a preoccupation with metaphysical subtleties. Early Buddhism reflected to some extent this philosophic and rational spirit of the Buddha, and its inquiries were based on experience. In the world of experience, the concept of pure being could not be grasped and was therefore put aside, so also the idea of a creator God, which was a presumption not capable of logical proof. Nevertheless, the experience remained and was real enough in a sense. What could this be except a mere flux of becoming, ever changing into something else? So these intermediate degrees of reality were recognized, and further inquiry proceeded on these lines on a psychological basis. Buddha, rebel as he was, hardly cut himself off from the ancient faith of the land. Mrs. Rhys Davids says that Gautam was born and brought up and lived and died as a Hindu. There was not much in the metaphysics and principles of Gautam, which cannot be found in one or other of the orthodox systems, and a great deal of his morality could be matched from earlier or later Hindu books. Such originality as Gautam possessed lay in the way in which he adapted, enlarged, ennobled, and systematized that which had already been well said by others, in the way in which he carried out to their logical conclusion principles of equity and justice already acknowledged by some of the most prominent Hindu thinkers. The difference between him and other teachers lay chiefly in his deep earnestness and in his broad public spirit of philanthropy. Footnote: this quotation, as well as much else, is taken from Sir S. Radhakrishnan's Indian Philosophy, published by George Allen and Unwin, in London, 1940. End of footnote. Yet Buddha had sown the seeds of revolt against the conventional practice of the religion of his day. It was not his theory or philosophy that was objected to, for every conceivable philosophy could be advocated within the fold of orthodox belief so long as it remained a theory, but the interference with the social life and organization of the people. The old system was free and flexible in thought, allowing for every variety of opinion, but in practice it was rigid, and nonconformity with practice was not approved. So, inevitably, Buddhism tended to break away from the old faith, and, after Buddha's death, the breach widened. With the decline of early Buddhism, the Mahayana form developed, the older form being known as the Hinayana. It was in this Mahayana that Buddha was made into a god and devotion to him as a personal god developed. The Buddha image also appeared from the Grecian northwest. About the same time there was a revival of Brahmanism in India and of Sanskrit scholarship. Between the Hinayana and the Mahayana there was bitter controversy, and the debate and opposition to each other has continued throughout subsequent history. The Hinayana countries, Ceylon, Burma, Siam, even now rather look down upon the Buddhism that prevails in China and Japan, and I suppose this feeling is reciprocated. While the Hinayana adhered, in some measure, to the ancient purity of doctrine and circumscribed it in a Pali canon, the Mahayana spread out in every direction, tolerating almost everything and adapting itself to each country's distinctive outlook. In India it began to approach the popular religion. In each of the other countries, China and Japan and Tibet, it had a separate development. Some of the greatest of the early Buddhist thinkers moved away from the agnostic attitude which Buddha had taken up in regard to the existence of the soul and rejected it completely. Among a galaxy of men of remarkable intellect, Nagarjuna stands out as one of the greatest minds that India has produced. He lived during Kanishka's reign, about the beginning of the Christian era, and he was chiefly responsible for formulating the Mahayana doctrines. The power and daring of his thought are remarkable, and he is not afraid of arriving at conclusions which to most people must have appeared as scandalous and shocking. With a ruthless logic he pursues his argument till it leads him to deny even what he believed in. Thought cannot know itself and cannot go outside itself or know another. There is no God apart from the universe, and no universe apart from God, and both are equally appearances. And so he goes on till there is nothing left, no distinction between truth and error, no possibility of understanding or misunderstanding anything, for how can anyone misunderstand the unreal? Nothing is real. The world has only a phenomenal existence, it is just an ideal system of qualities and relations, in which we believe but which we cannot intelligibly explain. Yet behind all this experience he hints at something, the absolute, which is beyond the capacity of our thinking, for in the very process of thought it becomes something relative. Footnote: Professor Theodor Strabotsky of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, in his book, The Conception of Buddhist Nirvana, Leningrad, 1927, suggests that Nagarjuna should be placed among the great philosophers of humanity. He refers to his wonderful style which never ceases to be interesting, bold, baffling, sometimes seemingly arrogant. He compares Nagarjuna's views with those of Bradley and Hegel. Very remarkable are then the coincidences between Nagarjuna's negativism and the condemnation by Mr. Bradley of almost every conception of the everyday world, things and qualities, relations, space and time, change, causation, motion, the self. From the Indian standpoint, Bradley can be characterized as a genuine Madhyamika. But above all these parallelisms we may perhaps find a still greater family likeness between the dialectical method of Hegel and Nagarjuna's dialectics. Strabotsky points out certain resemblances between some of the Buddhist schools of philosophy and the outlook of modern science, especially the conception of the final condition of the universe according to the law of entropy. He gives an interesting story. When the educational authorities of newly founded Republic of Burials in Transbaikalia in the USSR started an anti-religious propaganda, they emphasized that modern science takes a materialistic view of the universe. The Buddhist monks of that republic, who were Mahayanists, retorted in a pamphlet, pointing out that materialism was not unknown to them and that, in fact, one of their schools had developed a materialistic theory. End of footnote. This absolute is often referred to in Buddhist philosophy as shunyata or nothingness. Shunya is the word for the zero mark, yet it is something very different from our conception of vacancy or nothingness. Footnote: Professor Strabotsky, who is an authority on the subject, having personally examined the original texts in various languages, including Tibetan, says that shunyata is relativity. Everything being relative and interdependent has no absoluteness by itself. Hence it is shunya. On the other hand, there is something entirely beyond the phenomenal world, but comprising it, which might be considered the absolute. This cannot be conceived or described in terms of the finite and phenomenal world, and hence it is referred to as tata, or thatness, suchness. This absolute has also been called shunyata. End of footnote. In our world of experience we have to call it nothingness, for there is no other word for it, but in terms of metaphysical reality it means something transcendent and immanent in all things. Says a famous Buddhist scholar, it is on account of shunyata that everything becomes possible, without it nothing in the world is possible. All this shows where metaphysics leads to and how wise was Buddha's warning against such speculations. Yet the human mind refuses to imprison itself and continues to reach out for that fruit of knowledge which it well knows is beyond reach. Metaphysics developed in Buddhist philosophy, but the method was based on a psychological approach. Again, it is surprising to find the insight into the psychological states of the mind. The subconscious self of modern psychology is clearly envisaged and discussed. An extraordinary passage in one of the old books has been pointed out to me. This reminds one in a way of the Oedipus complex theory, though the approach is wholly different. Footnote: This occurs in Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosh, which was written in the early 5th century AC, collecting previous views and traditions. The original in Sanskrit has been lost. But Chinese and Tibetan translations exist. The Chinese translation is by the famous Chinese pilgrim to India, Sun Song. From this Chinese translation a French translation has been made, Paris Louvain, 1926. My colleague and companion in detention, Acharya Narendra Dev, has been translating this book from the French into Hindi and English, and he pointed out this passage to me. It is in the 3rd chapter. End of footnote. 4 definite schools of philosophy developed in Buddhism, 2 of these belong to the Hinayana branch, and 2 to the Mahayana. All these Buddhist systems of philosophy have their origin in the Upanishads, but they do not accept the authority of the Vedas. It is this denial of the Vedas that distinguishes them from the so-called Hindu systems of philosophy, which developed about the same time. These latter, while accepting the Vedas generally and, in a sense, paying formal obeisance to them, do not consider them as infallible, and indeed go their own way without much regard for them. As the Vedas and the Upanishads spoke with many voices, it was always possible for subsequent thinkers to emphasize one aspect rather than another, and to build their system on this foundation. Professor Radhakrishnan thus describes the logical movement of Buddhist thought as it found expression in the 4 schools. It begins with a dualistic metaphysics looking upon knowledge as a direct awareness of objects. In the next stage, ideas are made the media through which reality is apprehended, thus raising a screen between mind and things. These 2 stages represent the Hinayana schools. The Mahayana schools went further and abolished the things behind the images and reduced all experience to a series of ideas in their mind. The ideas of relativity and the subconscious self come in. In the last stage, this was Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka philosophy, or the middle way. Mind itself is dissolved into mere ideas, leaving us with loose units of ideas and perceptions about which we can say nothing definite. Thus we arrive finally at airy nothing, or something that is so difficult to grasp for our finite minds that it cannot be described or defined. The most we can say is that it is some kind of consciousness, Vigyan, as it is called. In spite of this conclusion arrived at by psychological and metaphysical analysis, which ultimately reduces the conception of the invisible world or the absolute to pure consciousness, and thus to nothing, so far as we can use or comprehend words, it is emphasized that ethical relations have a definite value in our finite world. So in our lives and in our human relations we have to conform to ethics and live the good life. To that life and to this phenomenal world we can and should apply reason and knowledge and experience. The infinite, or whatever it may be called, lies somewhere in the beyond, and to it therefore these cannot be applied. End of Part 10, titled, Buddhist Philosophy, of Chapter 5. Part 11, Effect of Buddhism on Hinduism. What was the effect of Buddha's teachings on the old Aryan religion and the popular beliefs that prevailed in India? There can be no doubt that they produced powerful and permanent effects on many aspects of religious and national life. Buddha may not have thought of himself as the founder of a new religion, probably he looked upon himself as a reformer only. But his dynamic personality and his forceful messages attacking many social and religious practices inevitably led to conflict with the entrenched priesthood. He did not claim to be an uprooter of the existing social order or economic system. He accepted their basic premises and only attacked the evils that had grown under them. Nevertheless, he functioned, to some extent, as a social revolutionary, and it was because of this that he angered the Brahmin class who were interested in the continuance of the existing social practices. There is nothing in Buddha's teachings that cannot be reconciled with the wide-flung range of Hindu thought. But when Brahmin supremacy was attacked, it was a different matter. It is interesting to note that Buddhism first took root in Magadh, that part of northern India where Brahmanism was weak. It spread gradually west and north, and many Brahmins also joined it. To begin with, it was essentially a Kshatriya movement but with a popular appeal. Probably it was due to the Brahmins, who later joined it, that it developed more along philosophical and metaphysical lines. It may have been due also chiefly to the Brahmin Buddhists that the Mahayana form developed, for, in some ways, and notably in its Catholic variety, this was more akin to the varied form of the existing Aryan faith. Buddhism influenced Indian life in 100 ways, as it was bound to, for it must be remembered that it was a living, dynamic, and widespread religion in India for over 1,000 years. Even in the long years of its decline in India, and when later it practically ceased to count as a separate religion here, much of it remained as a part of the Hindu faith and in national ways of life and thought. Even though the religion as such was ultimately rejected by the people, the ineffaceable imprint of it remained and powerfully influenced the development of the race. This permanent effect had little to do with dogma or philosophic theory or religious belief. It was the ethical and social and practical idealism of Buddha and his religion that influenced our people and left their imperishable marks upon them, even as the ethical ideals of Christianity affected Europe, though it may not pay much attention to its dogmas, and as Islam's human, social, and practical approach influenced many people who were not attracted by its religious forms and beliefs. The Aryan faith in India was essentially a national religion restricted to the land, and the social caste structure it was developing emphasized this aspect of it. There were no missionary enterprises, no proselytization, no looking outside the frontiers of India. Within India it proceeded on its own unobtrusive and subconscious way and absorbed newcomers and old, often forming new castes out of them. This attitude to the outside world was natural for those days, for communications were difficult and the need for foreign contacts hardly arose. There were no doubt such contacts for trade and other purposes, but they made no difference to India's life and ways. The ocean of Indian life was a self-contained one, big and diverse enough to allow full play for its many currents, self-conscious and absorbed in itself, caring little for what happened beyond its boundaries. In the very heart of this ocean burst forth a new spring, pouring out a fountain of fresh and limpid water, which ruffled the old surface and overflowed, not caring at all for those old boundaries and barriers that man and nature had erected. In this fountain of Buddha's teaching the appeal was to the nation, but it was also to more than the nation. It was a universal call for the good life, and it recognized no barriers of class or caste or nation. This was a novel approach for the India of his day. Ashoka was the first person to act upon it in a big way with his embassies to, and missionary activities in, foreign countries. India thus began to develop an awareness of the world, and probably it was largely this that led, in the early centuries of the Christian era, to vast colonial enterprises. These expeditions across the seas were organized by Hindu rulers, and they carried the Brahminical system and Aryan culture with them. This was an extraordinary development for a self-contained faith and culture which were gradually building up a mutually exclusive caste system. Only a powerful urge and something changing their basic outlook could have brought this about. That urge may have been due to many reasons, and most of all to trade and the needs of an expanding society, but the change of outlook was partly due to Buddhism and the foreign contacts it had brought about. Hinduism was dynamic enough and full of an overflowing energy at the time, but it had previously not paid much attention to foreign countries. One of the effects of the universalism of the new faith was to encourage this dynamic energy to flow out to distant countries. Much of the ritualism and ceremonial associated with the Vedic, as well as more popular forms of religion, disappeared, particularly animal sacrifices. The idea of nonviolence, already present in the Vedas and Upanishads, were emphasized by Buddhism and even more so by Jainism. There was a new respect for life and a kindness to animals. And always behind all this was the endeavor to lead the good life, the higher life. Buddha had denied the moral value of austere asceticism. But the whole effect of his teaching was one of pessimism towards life. This was especially the Hinayana view, and even more so that of Jainism. There was an emphasis on otherworldliness, a desire for liberation, of freedom from the burdens of the world. Sexual continence was encouraged and vegetarianism increased. All these ideas were present in India before the Buddha, but the emphasis was different. The emphasis of the old Aryan ideal was on a full and all-rounded life. The student stage was one of continence and discipline. The householder participated fully in life's activities and took sex as part of them. Then came a gradual withdrawal and a greater concentration on public service and individual improvement. Only the last stage of life, when old age had come, was that of sannyasa, or full withdrawal from life's normal work and attachments. Previously small groups of ascetically inclined people lived in forest settlements, usually attracting students. With the coming of Buddhism, huge monasteries and nunneries grew up everywhere, and there was a regular flow of population towards them. The very name of the province of Bihar today is derived from Vihad, monastery, which indicates how full that huge area must have been of monasteries. Such monasteries were educational establishments also, or were connected with schools and sometimes with universities. Not only India but the whole of Central Asia had large numbers of huge Buddhist monasteries. There was a famous one in Bach, accommodating 1,000 monks, of which we have many records. This was called Nava Vihad, the new monastery, which was Persianized into, now Bahad. Why was it that Buddhism resulted in the growth of otherworldliness in India far more than in some other countries where it has flourished for long periods, in China, Japan and Burma? I do not know, but I imagine that the national background of each country was strong enough to mold the religion according to its shape. China, for instance, had the powerful traditions derived from Confucius and Lao Tse and other philosophers. Then again, China and Japan adopted the Mahayana form of Buddhism, which was less pessimistic in its approach than the Hinayana. India was also influenced by Jainism, which was the most otherworldly and life-negating of all these doctrines and philosophies. Yet another very curious effect of Buddhism in India and on its social structure appears to have been one that was entirely opposed to its whole outlook. This was in relation to caste, which it did not approve of, though it accepted its original basis. The caste system in the time of the Buddha was flexible and had not developed the rigidity of later periods. More importance was attached to capacity, character, and occupation than to birth. Buddha himself often uses the term Brahmin as equivalent to an able, earnest, and disciplined person. There is a famous story in the Chandogya Upanishad which shows us how caste and sex relations were viewed then. This is the story of Satyakama, whose mother was Jabala. Satyakama wanted to become a student of the sage Gautam, not the Buddha, and, as he was leaving his home, he asked his mother, "Of what gotra, family or clan, am I?" His mother said to him, "I do not know, my child, of what family thou art. In my youth, when I had to move about much as a servant, waiting on the guests in my father's house, I conceived thee. I do not know of what family thou art. I was Jabala by name, thou art Satyakama. Say that thou art Satyakama Jabala, that is, Satyakama, the son of Jabala." Satyakama then went to Gautam, and the sage asked him about his family. He replied in the words of his mother. Thereupon the teacher said, "No one but a true Brahmin would thus speak out. Go and fetch fuel, friend. I shall initiate you. You have not swerved from the truth." Probably at the time of the Buddha the Brahmins were the only more or less rigid caste. The Kshatriya, or the ruling class, were proud of their group and family traditions, but, as a class, their doors were open for the incorporation of individuals or families who became rulers. For the rest, most people were Vaishyas, the agriculturists, an honored calling. There were other occupational castes also. The so-called casteless people, the untouchables, appear to have been very few, probably some forest folk and some whose occupation was the disposal of dead bodies, etc. The emphasis of Jainism and Buddhism on non-violence led to the tilling of the soil being considered a lowly occupation, for it often resulted in the destruction of animal life. This occupation, which had been the pride of the Indo-Aryans, went down in the scale of values in some parts of the country, in spite of its fundamental importance, and those who actually tilled the land descended in the social scale. Thus Buddhism, which was a revolt against priestcraft and ritualism and against the degradation of any human being and his deprivation of the opportunities of growth and leading a higher life, unconsciously led to the degradation of vast numbers of tillers of the soil. It would be wrong to make Buddhism responsible for this, for it had no such effect elsewhere. There was something inherent in the caste system which took it in this direction. Jainism pushed it along that way because of its passionate attachment to nonviolence. Buddhism also inadvertently helped in the process. End of Part 11, titled, Effect of Buddhism on Hinduism, of Chapter 5. Part 12, How did Hinduism absorb Buddhism in India? 8 or 9 years ago, when I was in Paris, André Malraux put me a strange question at the very beginning of our conversation. What was it, he asked me, that enabled Hinduism to push away organized Buddhism from India, without any major conflict, over 1,000 years ago? How did Hinduism succeed in absorbing, as it were, a great and widespread popular religion, without the usual wars of religion which disfigure the history of so many countries? What inner vitality or strength did Hinduism possess then which enabled it to perform this remarkable feat? And did India possess this inner vitality and strength today? If so, then her freedom and greatness were assured. The question was perhaps typical of a French intellectual who was also a man of action. And yet few persons in Europe or America would trouble themselves over such matters. They would be much too full of the problems of today. Those present-day world problems filled and troubled Malraux also, and with his powerful and analytical mind he sought light wherever he could find it, in the past or in the present, in thought, speech, writing, or, best of all, in action, in the game of life and death. For Malraux the question was obviously not just an academic one. He was full of it and he burst out with it as soon as we met. It was a question after my own heart, or rather the kind of question that my own mind was frequently framing. But I had no satisfactory answer to it for him or for myself. There are answers and explanations enough, but they seem to miss the core of the problem. It is clear that there was no widespread or violent extermination of Buddhism in India. Occasionally there were local troubles or conflicts between a Hindu ruler and the Buddhist Sangha, or organization of monks, which had grown powerful. These had usually a political origin and they did not make any essential difference. It must also be remembered that Hinduism was at no time wholly displaced by Buddhism. Even when Buddhism was at its height in India, Hinduism was widely prevalent. Buddhism died a natural death in India, or rather it was a fading out and a transformation into something else. India, says Keith, has a strange genius for converting what it borrows and assimilating it. If that is true of borrowings from abroad or from alien sources, still more is it applicable to something that came out of its own mind and thought. Buddhism was not only entirely a product of India, its philosophy was in line with previous Indian thought and the philosophy of the Vedanta, the Upanishads. The Upanishads had even ridiculed priestcraft and ritualism and minimized the importance of caste. Brahmanism and Buddhism acted and reacted on each other, and in spite of their dialectical conflicts or because of them, approached nearer to each other, both in the realm of philosophy and that of popular belief. The Mahayana especially approached the Brahminical system and forms. It was prepared to compromise with almost anything, so long as its ethical background remained. Brahmanism made of Buddha an avatar, a god. So did Buddhism. The Mahayana doctrine spread rapidly, but it lost in quality and distinctiveness what it gained in extent. The monasteries became rich, centers of vested interests, and their discipline became lax. Magic and superstition crept into the popular forms of worship. There was a progressive degeneration of Buddhism in India after the first millennium of its existence. Mrs. Rhys-Davids points out its diseased state during that period. Under the overpowering influence of these sickly imaginations, the moral teachings of Gautama have been almost hid from view. The theories grew and flourished, each new step, each new hypothesis demanded another, until the whole sky was filled with forgeries of the brain, and the nobler and simpler lessons of the founder of the religion were smothered beneath the glittering mass of metaphysical subtleties. Footnote, from S. Radhakrishnan's Indian Philosophy, published by Allen and Unwin, in London, 1927. End of footnote. This description might well apply to many of the sickly imaginings and forgeries of the brain which were afflicting Brahmanism and its offshoots at that time. Buddhism had started at a time of social and spiritual revival and reform in India. It infused the breath of new life in the people, it tapped new sources of popular strength and released new talent and capacity for leadership. Under the imperial patronage of Ashoka it spread rapidly and became the dominant religion of India. It spread also to other countries, and there was a constant stream of learned Buddhist scholars going abroad from India and coming to India. This stream continued for many centuries. When the Chinese pilgrim Fa Hien came to India in the 5th century AC, 1,000 years after Buddha, he saw that Buddhism was flourishing in its parent country. In the 7th century AC, the still more famous pilgrim Sun Song, or Yuan Chuang, came to India and witnessed signs of decay, although even then it was strong in some areas. Quite a large number of Buddhist scholars and monks gradually drifted from India to China. Meanwhile, there had been a revival of Brahmanism and a great cultural renaissance under the imperial Guptas in the 4th and 5th centuries AC. This was not anti-Buddhist in any way, but it certainly increased the importance and power of Brahmanism, and it was also a reaction against the otherworldliness of Buddhism. The later Guptas contended for long against Hun invasions and, though they drove them off ultimately, the country was weakened and a process of decay set in. There were several bright periods subsequently and many remarkable men arose. But both Brahmanism and Buddhism deteriorated and degrading practices grew up in them. It became difficult to distinguish the two. If Brahmanism absorbed Buddhism, this process changed Brahmanism also in many ways. In the 8th century, Shankaracharya, one of the greatest of India's philosophers, started religious orders or mutt, for Hindu sannyasis or monks. This was an adoption of the old Buddhist practice of the Sangha. Previously there had been no such organizations of sannyasis in Brahmanism, although small groups of them existed. Some degraded forms of Buddhism continued in East Bengal and in Zint in the northwest. Otherwise Buddhism gradually vanished from India as a widespread religion. End of Part 12, titled, How Did Hinduism Absorb Buddhism in India, of Chapter 5. Part 13, The Indian Philosophical Approach. Though one thought leads to another, each usually related to life's changing texture, and a logical movement of the human mind is sometimes discernible, yet thoughts overlap and the new and the old run side by side, irreconcilable and often contradicting each other. Even an individual's mind is a bundle of contradictions and it is difficult to reconcile his action one with another. A people, comprising all stages of cultural development, represent in themselves and in their thoughts, beliefs, and activities, different ages of the past leading up to the present. Probably their activities may conform more to the social and cultural pattern of the present day, or else they would be stranded and isolated from life's moving stream, but behind these activities lie primitive beliefs and unreasoned convictions. It is astonishing to find in countries industrially advanced, where every person automatically uses or takes advantage of the latest modern discovery or device, beliefs and set ideas which reason denies and intelligence cannot accept. A politician may of course succeed in his business without being a shining example of reason or intelligence. A lawyer may be a brilliant advocate and jurist and yet be singularly ignorant of other matters. Even a scientist, that typical representative of the modern age, often forgets the method and outlook of science when he goes out of his study or laboratory. This is so even in regard to the problems that affect our daily lives in their material aspects. In philosophy and metaphysics, the problems are more remote, less transient, and less connected with our day's routine. For most of us, they are entirely beyond our grasp unless we undergo a rigid discipline and training of the mind. And yet all of us have some kind of philosophy of life, conscious or unconscious, if not thought out then inherited or accepted from others and considered as self-evident. Or we may seek refuge from the perils of thought and faith in some religious creed or dogma, or in national destiny, or in a vague and comforting humanitarianism. Often all these and others are present together, though with little to connect them, and we develop split personalities, each functioning in its separate compartment. Probably there was more unity and harmony in the human personality in the old days, though this was at a lower level than today except for certain individuals who were obviously of a very high type. During this long age of transition, through which humanity has been passing, we have managed to break up that unity, but have not so far succeeded in finding another. We cling still to the ways of dogmatic religion, adhere to outworn practices and beliefs, and yet talk and presume to live in terms of the scientific method. Perhaps science has been too narrow in its approach to life and has ignored many vital aspects of it, and hence it could not provide a suitable basis for a new unity and harmony. Perhaps it is gradually broadening this basis now, and we shall achieve a new harmony for the human personality on a much higher level than the previous one. But the problem is a more difficult and complex one now, for it has grown beyond the limits of the human personality. It was perhaps easier to develop some kind of a harmonious personality in the restricted spheres of ancient and medieval times. In that little world of town and village, with fixed concepts of social organization and behavior, the individual and the group lived their self-contained lives, protected, as a rule, from outer storms. Today the sphere of even the individual has grown worldwide, and different concepts of social organization conflict with each other, and behind them are different philosophies of life. A strong wind arising somewhere creates a cyclone in one place and an anticyclone in another. So if harmony is to be achieved by the individual, it has to be supported by some kind of social harmony throughout the world. In India, far more so than elsewhere, the old concept of social organization and the philosophy of life underlying it have persisted, to some extent, to the present day. They could not have done so unless they had some virtue which stabilized society and made it conform to life's conditions. And they would not have failed ultimately and become a drag and a hindrance, divorced from life, if the evil in them had not overcome that virtue. But, in any event, they cannot be considered today as isolated phenomena, they must be viewed in that world context and made to harmonize with it. In India, says Havel, religion is hardly a dogma, but a working hypothesis of human conduct, adapted to different stages of spiritual development and different conditions of life. A dogma might continue to be believed in, isolated from life, but a working hypothesis of human conduct must work and conform to life, or it obstructs life. The very raison d'etre of such a hypothesis is its workableness, its conformity to life, and its capacity to adapt itself to changing conditions. So long as it can do so, it serves its purpose and performs its allotted function. When it goes off at a tangent from the curve of life, loses contact with social needs, and the distance between it and life grows, it loses all its vitality and significance. Metaphysical theories and speculations deal not with the ever-changing stuff of life but with the permanent reality behind it, if such exists. Hence they have a certain permanence which is not affected by external changes. But, inevitably, they are the products of the environment in which they grow and of the state of development of the human minds that conceived them. If their influence spreads, they affect the general philosophy of life of a people. In India, philosophy, though in its higher reaches confined to the elect, has been more pervasive than elsewhere and has had a strong influence in molding the national outlook and in developing a certain distinctive attitude of mind. Buddhist philosophy played an important part in this process and, during the medieval period, Islam left its impress upon the national outlook, directly as well as indirectly, through the evolution of new sects which sought to bridge the gap between Hinduism and the Islamic social and religious structure. But, in the main, the dominating influence has been that of the six systems of Indian philosophy, or darshanas, as they are called. Some of these systems were themselves greatly affected by Buddhist thought. All of them are considered orthodox and yet they vary in their approach and their conclusions, though they have many common ideas. There is polytheism, and theism with a personal God, and pure monism, and a system which ignores God altogether and bases itself on a theory of evolution. There is both idealism and realism. The various facets of the complex and inclusive Indian mind are shown in their unity and diversity. Max Muller drew attention to both these factors. The more have I become impressed with the truth that there is behind the variety of the six systems a common fund of what may be called national and popular philosophy, from which each thinker was allowed to draw for his own purposes. There is a common presumption in all of them, that the universe is orderly and functions according to law, that there is a mighty rhythm about it. Some such presumption becomes necessary, for otherwise there could hardly be any system to explain it. Though the law of causality, of cause and effect, functions, yet there is a measure of freedom to the individual to shape his own destiny. There is belief in rebirth and an emphasis on unselfish love and disinterested activity. Logic and reason are relied upon and used effectively for argument, but it is recognized that often intuition is greater than either. The general argument proceeds on a rational basis, insofar as reason can be applied to matters often outside its scope. Professor Keith has pointed out that the systems are indeed orthodox and admit the authority of the sacred scriptures, but they attack the problems of existence with human means, and scripture serves for all practical purposes but to lend sanctity to results which are achieved not only without its aid, but often in very dubious harmony with its tenets. End of Part 13, titled, The Indian Philosophical Approach, of Chapter 5. Part 14, The Six Systems of Philosophy. The early beginnings of the Indian systems of philosophy take us back to the pre-Buddhist era. They develop gradually, the Brahminical systems side by side with the Buddhist, often criticizing each other, often borrowing from one another. Before the beginning of the Christian era, 6 Brahminical systems had taken shape and crystallized themselves, out of the welter of many such systems. Each one of them represents an independent approach, a separate argument, and yet they were not isolated from each other but rather parts of a larger plan. The 6 systems are known as 1. Nyaya, 2. Vaishesika, 3. Samkhya, 4. Yoga, 5. Mimamsa, and 6. Vedanta. The Nyaya method is analytic and logical. In fact, Nyaya means logic or the science of right reasoning. It is similar in many ways to Aristotle's syllogisms, though there are also fundamental differences between the two. The principles underlying Nyaya logic were accepted by all the other systems, and, as a kind of mental discipline, Nyaya has been taught throughout the ancient and medieval periods and up to today in India's schools and universities. Modern education in India has discarded it, but wherever Sanskrit is taught in the old way, Nyaya is still an essential part of the curriculum. It was not only considered an indispensable preparation for the study of philosophy, but a necessary mental training for every educated person. It has had at least as important a place in the old scheme of Indian education as Aristotle's logic has had in European education. The method was, of course, very different from the modern scientific method of objective investigation. Nevertheless, it was critical and scientific in its own way, and, instead of relying on faith, tried to examine the objects of knowledge critically and to proceed step by methods of logical proof. There was some faith behind it, certain presumptions which were not capable of logical treatment. Having accepted some hypotheses, the system was built up on those foundations. It was presumed that there is a rhythm and unity in life and nature. There was belief in a personal God, in individual souls, and an atomic universe. The individual was neither the soul alone nor the body, but the product of their union. Reality was supposed to be a complex of souls and nature. The Vaishesika system resembles the Nyaya in many ways. It emphasizes the separateness of individual selves and objects, and develops the atomic theory of the universe. The principle of Dharma, the moral law, is said to govern the universe, and round this the whole system revolves. The hypothesis of a god is not clearly admitted. Between the Nyaya and Vaishika systems and early Buddhist philosophy there are many points of contact. On the whole they adopt a realistic approach. The Sankhya system, which Kapila, c. 7th century BC, is said to have shaped out of many early and pre-Buddhist currents of thought, is remarkable. According to Richard Garb, in Kapila's doctrine, for the first time in the history of the world, the complete independence and freedom of the human mind, its full confidence in its own powers, were exhibited. The Sankhya became a well-coordinated system after the rise of Buddhism. The theory is a purely philosophical and metaphysical conception arising out of the mind of man and having little to do with objective observation. Indeed, such observation was not possible in matters beyond its reach. Like Buddhism, Sankhya proceeded along rationalistic lines of inquiry and met the challenge of Buddhism on the latter's own ground of reasoned argument without support of authority. Because of this rationalistic approach, God had to be ruled out. In Sankhya thus there is neither a personal God nor an impersonal one, neither monotheism nor monism. Its approach was atheistic and it undermined the foundations of a supernatural religion. There is no creation of the universe by a god, but rather a constant evolution, the product of interaction between spirit, or rather spirits, and matter, though that matter itself is of the nature of energy. This evolution is a continuous process. The Sankhya is called Dvait, or a dualistic philosophy, because it builds its structure on two primary causes, Prakriti, or an ever-active and changing nature or energy, and Purusha, the spirit which does not change. There is an infinite number of Purushas or souls, or something in the nature of consciousness. Under the influence of Purusha, which itself is inactive, Prakriti evolves and leads to the world of continuous becoming. Causality is accepted, but it is said that the effect really exists hidden in the cause. Cause and effect become the undeveloped and developed states of one and the same thing. From our practical point of view, however, cause and effect are different and distinct, but basically there is an identity between them. And so the argument goes on, showing how from the unmanifested Prakriti or energy, through the influence of Purusha or consciousness, and the principle of causality, nature with its immense complexity and variety of elements has developed and is ever changing and developing. Between the lowest and the highest in the universe there is a continuity and a unity. The whole conception is metaphysical, and the argument, based on certain hypotheses, is long, intricate, and reasoned. The yoga system of Patanjali is essentially a method for the discipline of the body and the mind leading up to psychic and spiritual training. Patanjali not only crystallized this old system but also wrote a famous commentary on Panini's Sanskrit grammar. This commentary, called the Mahabhashya, is as much of a classic as Panini's work. Professor Strabotsky, of Leningrad, has written that the ideal scientific work for India is the grammar of Panini with the Mahabhashya of Patanjali. Footnote: it is not established that Patanjali, the grammarian, was the same person as Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutras. The grammarian's date is definitely known, 2nd century BC. Some people are of opinion that the author of the Yoga Sutras was a different person, and lived 200 or 300 years later. End of footnote. Yoga is a word well known now in Europe and America, though little understood, and it is associated with quaint practices, more especially with sitting Buddha-like and gazing on one's navel or the tip of one's nose. Footnote: the word yoga means union. Possibly it is derived from the same root as the English word yoke, joining. End of footnote. Some people learning odd tricks of the body presume to become authorities on the subject in the West, and impress and exploit the credulous and the seekers after the sensational. The system is much more than these devices and is based on the psychological conception that by proper training of the mind certain higher levels of consciousness can be reached. It is meant to be a method for finding out things for oneself rather than a preconceived metaphysical theory of reality or of the universe. It is thus experimental and the most suitable conditions for carrying out the experiment are pointed out. As such a method it can be adopted and used by any system of philosophy, whatever its theoretical approach may be. Thus the adherents of the atheistic Sankhya philosophy may use this method. Buddhism developed its own forms of yoga training, partly similar, partly different. The theoretical parts of Patanjali's yoga system are therefore of relatively small importance, it is the method that counts. Belief in God is no integral part of the system, but it is suggested that such belief in a personal God, and devotion to Him, helps in concentrating the mind and thus serves a practical purpose. The later stages of yoga are supposed to lead to some kind of intuitive insight or to a condition of ecstasy, such as the mystics speak of. Whether this is some kind of higher mental state, opening the door to further knowledge, or is merely a kind of self-hypnosis, I do not know. Even if the former is possible, the latter certainly also happens, and it is well known that unregulated yoga has sometimes led to unfortunate consequences so far as the mind of the person is concerned. But before these final stages of meditation and contemplation are reached, there is the discipline of the body and mind to be practiced. The body should be fit and healthy, supple and graceful, hard and strong. A number of bodily exercises are prescribed, as also ways of breathing, in order to have some control over it and normally to take deep and long breaths. Exercises is the wrong word, for they involve no strenuous movement. They are rather postures, asanas, as they are called, and properly done, they relax and tone up the body, and do not tire it at all. This old and typical Indian method of preserving bodily fitness is rather remarkable when one compares it with the more usual methods involving rushing about, jerks, hops, and jumps which leave one panting, out of breath, and tired out. These other methods have also been common enough in India, as have wrestling, swimming, riding, fencing, archery, Indian clubs, something in the nature of jiu-jitsu, and many other pastimes and games. But the old asana method is perhaps more typical of India and seems to fit in with the spirit of her philosophy. There is a poise in it and an unruffled calm even while it exercises the body. Strength and fitness are gained without any waste of energy or disturbance of the mind. And because of this, the asanas are suited to any age, and some of them can be performed even by the old. There are a large number of these asanas. For many years now I have practiced a few simple selected ones, whenever I have had the chance, and I have no doubt that I have profited greatly by them, living as I often did in environments unfavorable to the mind and body. These and some breathing exercises are the extent of my practice of the physical exercises of the yoga system. I have not gone beyond the elementary stages of the body, and my mind continues to be an unruly member, misbehaving far too often. The discipline of the body, which includes eating and drinking the right things and avoiding the wrong ones, is to be accompanied by what the yoga system describes as ethical preparation. This includes non-violence, truthfulness, continence, etc. Non-violence or ahimsa is something much more than abstention from physical violence. It is an avoidance of malice and hatred. All this is supposed to lead to a control of the senses, then comes contemplation and meditation, and finally intense concentration, which should lead to various kinds of intuition. Vivekananda, one of the greatest of the modern exponents of yoga and the Vedanta, has laid repeated stress on the experimental character of yoga and on basing it on reason. No one of these yogas gives up reason, no one asks you to be hoodwinked or to deliver your reason into the hands of priests of any type whatsoever. Each one of them tells you to cling to your reason, to hold fast to it. Though the spirit of yoga and the Vedanta may be akin to the spirit of science, it is true that they deal with different media, and hence vital differences creep in. According to the yoga, the spirit is not limited to the intelligence, and also thought is action, and only action can make thought of any value. Inspiration and intuition are recognized, but may they not lead to deception? Vivekananda answers that inspiration must not contradict reason. What we call inspiration is the development of reason. The way to intuition is through reason. No genuine inspiration ever contradicts reason. Where it does, it is no inspiration. Also, inspiration must be for the good of one and all, and not for name or fame or personal gain. It should always be for the good of the world, and perfectly unselfish. Again, experience is the only source of knowledge. The same methods of investigation which we apply to the sciences and to exterior knowledge should be applied to religion. If a religion is destroyed by such investigation, it was nothing but a useless and unworthy superstition. The sooner it disappeared, the better. Why religions should claim that they are not bound to abide by the standpoint of reason, no one knows. For it is better that mankind should become atheists by following reason than blindly believe in 200 million gods on the authority of anybody. Perhaps there are prophets who have passed the limits of sense and obtained a glimpse of the beyond. We shall believe it only when we can do the same ourselves, not before. It is said that reason is not strong enough, that often it makes mistakes. If reason is weak, why should a body of priests be considered any better guides? I will abide by my reason, continues Vivekananda, because with all its weakness there is some chance of my getting at truth through it. We should therefore follow reason, and also sympathize with those who do not come to any sort of belief, following reason. In the study of this Raja Yoga, no faith or belief is necessary. Believe nothing until you find it out for yourself. Footnote. Most of the extracts from Vivekananda's writings have been taken from Raman Roland's Life of Vivekanand. End of footnote. Vivekananda's unceasing stress on reason, and his refusal to take anything on trust, derived from his passionate belief in the freedom of the mind, and also because he had seen the evils of authority in his own country. For I was born in a country where they have gone to the extreme of authority. He interpreted, and he had the right to interpret, the old yoga systems and the Vedanta accordingly. But, however much experiment and reason may be at the back of them, they deal with regions which are beyond the reach or even the understanding of the average man, a realm of psychical and psychological experiences entirely different from the world we know and are used to. Those experiments and experiences have certainly not been confined to India, and there is abundant evidence of them in the records of Christian mystics, Persian Sufis, and others. It is extraordinary how these experiences resemble each other, demonstrating, as Raman Roland says, the universality and perennial occurrence of the great facts of religious experience, their close resemblance under the diverse costumes of race and time, attesting to the persistent unity of the human spirit, or rather, for it goes deeper than the spirit, which is itself obliged to delve for it, to the identity of the materials constituting humanity. Yoga, then, is an experimental system of probing into the psychical background of the individual and thus developing certain perceptions and control of the mind. How far this can be utilized to advantage by modern psychology, I do not know, but some attempt to do so seems worthwhile. Aurobindo Ghose has defined yoga as follows: all Raja Yoga depends on this perception and experience, that our inner elements, combinations, functions, forces, can be separated or dissolved, can be newly combined and set to novel and formerly impossible uses, or can be transformed and resolved into a new general synthesis by fixed internal processes. The next system of philosophy is known as the Mimamsa. This is ritualistic and tends towards polytheism. Modern popular Hinduism as well as Hindu law have been largely influenced by this system and its rules, which lay down the Dharma or the scheme of right living as conceived by it. It might be noted that the polytheism of the Hindus is of a curious variety, for the Devas, the shining ones or gods, for all their special powers are supposed to be of a lower order of creation than man. Both the Hindus and Buddhists believe that human birth is the highest stage, that the being has reached on the road to self-realization. Even the Devas can only achieve this freedom and realization through human birth. This conception is evidently far removed from normal polytheism. Buddhists say that only man can attain the supreme consummation of Buddhahood. Sixthly and lastly in this series comes the Vedanta system, which, arising out of the Upanishads, developed and took many shapes and forms, but was always based on a monistic philosophy of the universe. The Purusha and Prakriti of the Samkhya are not considered as independent substances but as modifications of a single reality, the Absolute. On the foundation of the early Vedanta, Shankara, or Shankaracharya, built a system which is called the Advaita Vedanta or non-dualist Vedanta. It is this philosophy which represents the dominant philosophic outlook of Hinduism today. It is based on pure monism, the only ultimate reality in the metaphysical sense being the Atman, the Absolute Soul. That is the subject, all else is objective. How that Absolute Soul pervades everything, how the one appears as the many, and yet retains its wholeness, for the Absolute is indivisible and cannot be divided, all this cannot be accounted for by the processes of logical reasoning, for our minds are limited by the finite world. The Upanishad had described this Atman, if this can be called a description, thus: whole is that, whole, too, is this, from whole, whole cometh, take whole from whole, yet, whole remains. Shankara builds a subtle and intricate theory of knowledge and proceeding from certain assumptions, step, by logical argument, leads up to the complete system of Advaitism or non-dualism. The individual soul is not a separate entity but that Absolute Soul itself, though limited in some ways. It is compared to the space enclosed in a jar, the Atman being universal space. For practical purposes they may be treated as distinct from one another, but this distinction is apparent only, not real. Freedom consists in realizing this unity, this oneness of the individual with the Absolute Soul. The phenomenal world we see about us thus becomes a mere reflection of that reality, or a shadow cast by it on the empirical plane. It has been called Maya, which has been mistranslated as illusion. But it is not non-existence. It is an intermediate form between being and non-being. It is a kind of relative existence, and so perhaps the conception of relativity brings us nearer to the meaning of Maya. What is good and evil then in this world? Are they also mere reflections and shadows with no substance? Whatever they may be in the ultimate analysis in this empirical world of ours, there is a validity and importance in these ethical distinctions. They are relevant where individuals function as such. These finite individuals cannot imagine the infinite without limiting it, they can only form limited and objective conceptions of it. Yet even these finite forms and concepts rest ultimately in the infinite and absolute. Hence the form of religion becomes a relative affair, and each individual has liberty to form such conceptions as he is capable of. Shankara accepted the Brahminical organization of social life on the caste basis, as representing the collective experience and wisdom of the race. But he held that any person belonging to any caste could attain the highest knowledge. There is about Shankara's attitude and philosophy a sense of world negation and withdrawal from the normal activities of the world in search for that freedom of the self which was to him the final goal for every person. There is also a continual insistence on self-sacrifice and detachment. And yet Shankara was a man of amazing energy and vast activity. He was no escapist retiring into his shell or into a corner of the forest, seeking his own individual perfection and oblivious of what happened to others. Born in Malabar in the far south of India, he traveled incessantly all over India, meeting innumerable people, arguing, debating, reasoning, convincing, and filling them with a part of his own passion and tremendous vitality. He was evidently a man who was intensely conscious of his mission, a man who looked upon the whole of India from Cape Comorin to the Himalayas as his field of action and as something that held together culturally and was infused by the same spirit, though this might take many external forms. He strove hard to synthesize the diverse currents that were troubling the mind of India of his day and to build a unity of outlook out of that diversity. In a brief life of 32 years he did the work of many long lives and left such an impress of his powerful mind and rich personality on India that it is very evident today. He was a curious mixture of a philosopher and a scholar, an agnostic and a mystic, a poet and a saint, and in addition to all this, a practical reformer and an able organizer. He built up, for the first time within the Brahminical fold, 10 religious orders, and of these 4 are very much alive today. He established 4 great mutts or monasteries, locating them far from each other, almost at the 4 corners of India. One of these was in the south at Sringeri in Mysore, another at Puri on the east coast, the third at Dwarka, in Kathiawad, on the west coast, and the 4th at Badrinath, in the heart of the Himalayas. At the age of 32 this Brahmin from the tropical south died at Kedarnath, in the upper snow-covered reaches of the Himalayas. There is a significance about these long journeys of Shankara throughout this vast land at a time when travel was difficult and the means of transport very slow and primitive. The very conception of these journeys, and his meeting kindred souls everywhere and speaking to them in Sanskrit, the common language of the learned throughout India, brings out the essential unity of India even in those far-off days. Such journeys could not have been uncommon then or earlier. People went to and fro in spite of political divisions, new books traveled, and every new thought or fresh theory spread rapidly over the entire country and became the subject of interested talk and often of heated debate. There was not only a common intellectual and cultural life among the educated people, but vast numbers of common folk were continually traveling to the numerous places of pilgrimage, spread out all over the land and famous from epoch times. All this going to and fro and meeting people from different parts of the country must have intensified the conception of a common land and a common culture. This traveling was not confined to the upper castes. Among the pilgrims were men and women of all castes and classes. Whatever the religious significance of these pilgrimages in the minds of the people might have been, they were looked upon also, as they are today, as holiday time and opportunities for merrymaking and seeing different parts of the country. Every place of pilgrimage contained a cross-section of the people of India in all their great variety of custom, dress, and language, and yet very conscious of their common features and the bonds that held them together and brought all of them to meet in one place. Even the difference of language between the north and the south did not prove a formidable barrier to this intercourse. All this was so then, and Shankara was doubtless fully aware of it. It would seem that Shankara wanted to add to this sense of national unity and common consciousness. He functioned on the intellectual, philosophical and religious plane and tried to bring about a greater unity of thought all over the country. He functioned also on the popular plane in many ways, destroying many a dogma and opening the door of his philosophic sanctuary to everyone who was capable of entering it. By locating his 4 great monasteries in the north, south, east, and west, he evidently wanted to encourage the conception of a culturally united India. These 4 places had been previously places of pilgrimage from all parts of the country, and now became more so. How well the ancient Indians chose their sacred places of pilgrimage. Almost always they are lovely spots with beautiful natural surroundings. There is the icy cave of Amarnath in Kashmir, and there is the temple of the Virgin Goddess right at the southern tip of India at Rameshwaram, near Cape Comorin. There is Benares, of course, and Haridwar, nestling at the foot of the Himalayas, where the Ganges flows out of its tortuous mountain valleys into the plains below, and Prayag, or Allahabad, where the Ganges meets the Jamna, and Mathura, and Vrindavan by the Jamna, round which the Krishna legends cluster, and Bodh Gaya, where Buddha is said to have attained enlightenment, and so many places in the south. Many of the old temples, especially in the south, contain famous sculptures and other artistic remains. A visit to many of the places of pilgrimage thus gives an insight into old Indian art. Shankara is said to have helped in putting an end to Buddhism in India as a widespread religion, and that thereafter Brahmanism absorbed it in a fraternal embrace. But Buddhism had shrunk in India even before Shankara's time. Some of Shankara's Brahmin opponents called him a disguised Buddhist. It is true that Buddhism influenced him considerably. End of Part 14, titled, The 6 Systems of Philosophy, of Chapter 5. Part 15, India and China. It was through Buddhism that China and India came near to each other and developed many contacts. Whether there were any such contacts before Ashoka's reign we do not know. Probably there was some seaborne trade, for silk used to come from China. Yet there must have been overland contacts and migrations of peoples in far earlier periods, for Mongoloid features are common in the eastern border areas of India. In Nepal these are very marked. In Assam, Kamarupa of old, and Bengal they are often evident. Historically speaking, however, Ashoka's missionaries blazed the trail and, as Buddhism spread in China, there began that long succession of pilgrims and scholars who journeyed between India and China for 1,000 years. They traveled overland across the Gobi Desert and the plains and mountains of Central Asia and over the Himalayas, a long, hard journey full of peril. Many Indians and Chinese perished on the way, and one account says that as many as 90% of these pilgrims perished. Many, having managed to reach the end of their journey, did not return and settled in the land of their adoption. There was another route also, not much safer, though probably shorter. This was by sea via Indochina, Java, and Sumatra, Malaya and the Nicobar Islands. This was also frequently used, and sometimes a pilgrim traveled overland and returned by sea. Buddhism and Indian culture had spread all over Central Asia and in parts of Indonesia, and there were large numbers of monasteries and study centers dotted all over these vast areas. Travelers from India or China thus found a welcome and shelter along these routes by land and sea. Sometimes scholars from China would break journey for a few months at some Indian colony in Indonesia in order to learn Sanskrit before they came to India. The first record of an Indian scholar's visit to China is that of Kashyap Mating, who reached China in 67 AD in the reign of the Emperor Ming-ti, and probably at his invitation. He settled down at Loyang by the Lo River. Dharma Raksha accompanied him, and in later years, among the noted scholars who went were Buddhabhadra, Zinabhadra, Kumad Jiva, Paramart, Zinagupta, and Bodh-i-Derm. Each one of these took a group of monks or disciples with him. It is said that at one time, 6th century AC, there were more than 3,000 Indian Buddhist monks and 10,000 Indian families in the Loyang province alone. These Indian scholars who went to China not only carried many Sanskrit manuscripts with them, which they translated into Chinese, but some of them also wrote original books in the Chinese language. They made quite a considerable contribution to Chinese literature, including poetry. Kumad Jiva, who went to China in 401 AC, was a prolific writer, and as many as 47 different books written by him have come down to us. His Chinese style is supposed to be very good. He translated the life of the great Indian scholar Nagarjuna into Chinese. Zinagupta went to China in the second half of the 60th century AC. He translated 37 original Sanskrit works into Chinese. His great knowledge was so much admired that an emperor of the Tang dynasty became his disciple. There was two-way traffic between India and China, and many Chinese scholars came here. Among the best known who have left records of their journeys are Fa Hien, or Fa Shen, Sung Yun, Sun Song, or Xuan Chuang, and Yit Sing, or Yit Sing. Fa Hien came to India in the 5th century. He was a disciple of Kumad Jiva in China. There is an interesting account of what Kumad Jiva told him on the eve of his departure for India, when he went to take leave of his teacher. Kumad Jiva charged him not to spend all his time in gathering religious knowledge only but to study in some detail the life and habits of the people of India, so that China might understand them and their country as a whole. Fa Hien studied at Pataliputra University. The most famous of the Chinese travelers to India was Sun Song, who came in the 7th century, when the great Tang dynasty flourished in China, and Harshvardhan ruled over an empire in North India. Sun Song came overland across the Gobi Desert and passing Turfan in Kucha, Tashkent and Samarkand, Balkh, Khotan, and Yarkand, crossed the Himalayas into India. He tells us of his many adventures, of the perils he overcame, of the Buddhist rulers and monasteries in Central Asia, and of the Turks there who were ardent Buddhists. In India he traveled all over the country, greatly honored and respected everywhere, making accurate observations of places and peoples, and noting down some delightful and some fantastic stories that he heard. Many years he spent at the great Nalanda University, not far from Pataliputra, which was famous for its many-sided learning and attracted students from far corners of the country. It is said that as many as 10,000 students and monks were in residence there. Sun Song took the degree of Master of the Law there and finally became Vice Principal of the university. Sun Song's book The Siyu Ki, or The Record of the Western Kingdom, meaning India, makes fascinating reading. Coming from a highly civilized and sophisticated country, at a time when China's capital Fu was a center of art and learning, his comments on and descriptions of conditions in India are valuable. He tells us of the system of education which began early and proceeded by stages to the university, where the 5 branches of knowledge taught were 1. Grammar, 2. Science of arts and crafts, 3. Medicine, 4. Logic, and 5. Philosophy. He was particularly struck by the love of learning of the Indian people. Some kind of primary education was fairly widespread, as all the monks and priests were teachers. Of the people he says, with respect to the ordinary people, although they are naturally light-minded, yet they are upright and honorable. In money matters they are without craft, and in administering justice they are considerate. They are not deceitful or treacherous in their conduct, and are faithful in their oaths and promises. In their rules of government there is remarkable rectitude, whilst in their behavior there is much gentleness and sweetness. With respect to criminals or rebels, these are few in number, and only occasionally troublesome. He says further, as the administration of the government is founded on benign principles, the executive is simple. People are not subject to forced labor. In this way taxes on people are light. The merchants who engage in commerce come and go in carrying out their transactions. Sun Song returned the way he came, via Central Asia, carrying a large number of manuscripts with him. From his account one gathers a vivid impression of the wide sway of Buddhism in Khorasan, Iraq, Mosul, and right up to the frontiers of Syria. And yet this was a time when Buddhism was in decay there, and Islam, already beginning in Arabia, was soon to spread out over all these lands. About the Iranian people, Sun Song makes an interesting observation: they care not for learning, but give themselves entirely to works of art. All they make the neighboring countries value very much. Iran then, as before and after, concentrated on adding to the beauty and grace of life, and its influence spread far in Asia. Of the strange little kingdom of Turfan, on the edge of the Gobi Desert, Sun Song tells us, and we have learned more about it in recent years from the work of archaeologists. Here many cultures came and mixed and coalesced, producing a rich combination which drew its inspiration from China and India and Persia and even Hellenic sources. The language was Indo-European, derived from India and Iran, and resembling in some ways the Celtic languages of Europe. The religion came from India, the ways of life were Chinese, many of the artistic wares they had were from Iran. The statues and frescoes of the Buddhas and gods and goddesses, beautifully made, have often Indian draperies and Grecian headdresses. These goddesses, says Monsieur Grousset, represent the happiest combination of Hindu suppleness, Hellenic eloquence, and Chinese charm. Sun Song went back to his homeland, welcomed by his emperor and his people, and settled down to write his book and translate the many manuscripts he had brought. When he had started on his journey, many years earlier, there is a story that the Emperor Tang mixed a handful of dust in a drink and offered this to him, saying, "You would do well to drink this cup, for are we not told that a handful of one's country's soil is worth more than 10,000 pounds of foreign gold?" Sun Song's visit to India and the great respect in which he was held both in China and India led to the establishment of political contacts between the rulers of the two countries. Harshvardhan, of Kannauj, and the Tang Emperor, exchanged embassies. Sun Song himself remained in touch with India, exchanging letters with friends there and receiving manuscripts. Two interesting letters, originally written in Sanskrit, have been preserved in China. One of these was written in 654 AC by an Indian Buddhist scholar, Stavid Pragyadeva, to Sun Song. After greeting and news about common friends and their literary work, he proceeds to say, "We are sending you a pair of white cloths to show that we are not forgetful. The road is long, so do not mind the smallness of the present. We wish you may accept it. As regards the sutras and shastras which you may require, please send us a list. We will copy them and send them to you." I learnt from an ambassador who recently came back from India that the great teacher, Shilabhadra, was no more. This news overwhelmed me with grief that knew no bounds among the sutras and shastras that I, Sun Song, had brought with me. I have already translated the Yogacharya Bhumi Shastra and other works, in all 30 volumes. I should humbly let you know that while crossing the Indus I had lost a load of sacred texts. I now send you a list of the texts annexed to this letter. I request you to send them to me if you get the chance. I am sending some small articles as presents. Please accept them. Footnote, quoted in India and China by Dr. P.C. Bagchi, published in Calcutta, 1944. End of footnote. Sun Song has told us much of Nalanda University, and there are other accounts of it also. Yet when I went, some years ago, and saw the excavated ruins of Nalanda, I was amazed at their extent, and the huge scale on which it was planned. Only a part of it has so far been uncovered, and over the rest there are inhabited localities, but even this part consisted of huge courts surrounded by stately buildings in stone. Soon after Sun Song's death in China, yet another famous Chinese pilgrim made the journey to India, Yitsing, or Yitsing. He started in 671 AC, and it took him nearly 2 years to reach the Indian port of Tamralipti, at the mouth of the Hooghly. For he came by sea and stopped for many months at Sribhoga, modern Palembang in Sumatra, to study Sanskrit. This journey of his by sea has a certain significance, for it is probable that there were disturbed conditions in Central Asia then and political changes were taking place. Many of the friendly Buddhist monasteries that dotted the land route may have ceased to exist. It is also likely that the sea route was more convenient with the growth of Indian colonies in Indonesia, and constant trade and other contacts between India and these countries. It appears from his and other accounts that there was at that time regular navigation between Persia, Iran, India, Malaya, Sumatra, and China. Yitsing sailed in a Persian ship from Kwangtung, and went first to Sumatra. Yitsing also studied at Nalanda University for a long time and carried back with him several hundred Sanskrit texts. He was chiefly interested in the fine points of Buddhist ritual and ceremonial and has written in detail about them. But he tells us much also about customs, clothes, and food. Wheat was the staple diet in North India, as now, and rice in the south and the east. Meat was sometimes eaten, but this was rare. Yitsing probably tells us more about the Buddhist monks than about others. Ghee, clarified butter, oil, milk, and cream were found everywhere, and cakes and fruits were abundant. Yitsing noted the importance that Indians have always attached to a certain ceremonial purity. Now the first and chief difference between India of the 5 regions and other nations is the peculiar distinction between purity and impurity. Also, to preserve what has been left from the meal, as is done in China, is not at all in accordance with Indian rules. Yitsing refers to India generally as the West, Safang, but he tells us that it was known as Arya days, the Arya days. Arya means noble, days region, the noble region, a name for the West. It is so called because men of noble character appear there successively, and people all praise the land by that name. It is also called Madhya days, that is, the middle land, for it is the center of 100 myriads of countries. The people are all familiar with this name. The northern tribes, who are Mongols or Turks, alone call the noble land Hindu, Shintu, but this is not at all a common name, it is only a vernacular name, and has no special significance. The people of India do not know this designation, and the most suitable name for India is the noble land. Yitsing's reference to Hindu is interesting. He goes on to say, some say that Indu means the moon, and the Chinese name for India, that is, Indu, Yintu, is derived from it. Although it might mean this, it is nevertheless not the common name. As for the Indian name for the Great Cho, China, that is, Chin, it is a name and has no special meaning. He also mentions the Sanskrit names for Korea and other countries. For all his admiration for India and many things Indian, Tsing made it clear that he gave first place to his native land, China. India might be the noble region, but China was the divine land. The people of the 5 parts of India are proud of their own purity and excellence. But high refinement, literary elegance, propriety, moderation, ceremonies of welcoming and parting, the delicious taste of food, and the richness of benevolence and righteousness are found in China only, and no other country can excel her. In the healing arts of acupuncture and cautery and the skill of feeling the pulse, China has never been superseded by any part of India. The medicament for prolonging life is only found in China. From the character of men and the quality of things, China is called the divine land. Is there anyone in the 5 parts of India who does not admire China? The word used in the Old Sanskrit for the Chinese emperor is Devaputra, which is an exact translation of Son of Heaven. Tsing, himself a fine scholar in Sanskrit, praises the language and says it is respected in far countries in the north and south. How much more then should people of the divine land, China, as well as the celestial storehouse, India, teach the real rules of the language? Footnote: these extracts have been taken from J. Takakusu's translation of Tsing's, A Record of the Buddhist Religions as Practiced in India and Malay Archipelago, published by Oxford, 1896. End of footnote. Sanskrit scholarship must have been fairly widespread in China. It is interesting to find that some Chinese scholars tried to introduce Sanskrit phonetics into the Chinese language. A well-known example of this is that of the monk Shan Wen, who lived at the time of the Tang dynasty. He tried to develop an alphabetical system along these lines in Chinese. With the decay of Buddhism in India, this Indo-Chinese commerce of scholars practically ceased, though pilgrims from China occasionally came to visit the holy places of Buddhism in India. During the political revolutions from the 11th century AC onwards, crowds of Buddhist monks, carrying bundles of manuscripts, went to Nepal or crossed the Himalayas, into Tibet. A considerable part of old Indian literature thus and previously found its way to China and Tibet, and in recent years it has been discovered afresh there in the original or more frequently, in translations. Many Indian classics have been preserved in Chinese and Tibetan translations relating not only to Buddhism but also to Brahmanism, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, etc. There are supposed to be 8,000 such works in the Sung Pao collection in China. Tibet is full of them. There used to be frequent cooperation between Indian, Chinese, and Tibetan scholars. A notable instance of this cooperation, still extant, is a Sanskrit-Tibetan Chinese dictionary of Buddhist technical terms. This dates from the 9th or 10th century AC and is named the Mahavyutpatti. Among the most ancient printed books discovered in China, dating from the 8th century AC, are books in Sanskrit. These were printed from wooden blocks. In the 10th century, the Imperial Printing Commission was organized in China, and as a result of this, and right up to the Sung era, the art of printing developed rapidly. It is surprising and difficult to account for that, in spite of the close contacts between Indian and Chinese scholars and their exchanges of books and manuscripts for hundreds of years, there is no evidence whatever of the printing of books in India during that period. Block printing went to Tibet from China at some early period and, I believe, it is still practiced there. Chinese printing was introduced into Europe during the Mongol or Yuan dynasty, 1260 to 1368. First known in Germany, it spread to other countries during the 15th century. Even during the Indo-Afghan and Mughal periods in India, there was occasional diplomatic intercourse between India and China. Mohammed bin Tughlaq, Sultan of Delhi, 1326–51, sent the famous Arab traveler, Ibn Battuta, as ambassador to the Chinese court. Bengal had at that time shaken off the suzerainty of Delhi and became an independent sultanate. In the middle of the 14th century, the Chinese court sent 2 ambassadors, Hushin and Fin Shin, to the Bengal Sultan. This led to a succession of ambassadors being sent, from Bengal to China, during Sultan Ghiyas-ud-Din's reign. This was the period of the Ming emperors in China. One of the later embassies, sent in 1414 by Saifuddin, carried valuable presents, among them a live giraffe. How a giraffe managed to reach India is a mystery. Probably it came as a gift from Africa and was sent on to the Ming emperor as a rarity which would be appreciated. It was indeed greatly appreciated in China, where a giraffe is considered an auspicious symbol by the followers of Confucius. There is no doubt that the animal was a giraffe for, apart from a long account of it, there is also a Chinese picture of it on silk. The court artist, who made this picture, has written a long account in praise of it and of the good fortune that flows from it. The ministers and the people all gathered to gaze at it, and their joy knows no end. Trade between India and China, which had flourished during the Buddhist period, was continued throughout the Indo-Afghan and Mughal periods, and there was a continuous exchange of commodities. The trade went overland across the northern Himalayan passes and along the old caravan routes of Central Asia. There was also a considerable seaborne trade, via the islands of Southeast Asia, chiefly to South Indian ports. During these 1,000 years and more of intercourse between India and China, each country learned something from the other, not only in the regions of thought and philosophy, but also in the arts and sciences of life. Probably China was more influenced by India than India by China, which is a pity, for India could well have received, with profit to herself, some of the sound common sense of the Chinese, and with its aid checked her own extravagant fancies. China took much from India, but she was always strong and self-confident enough to take it in her own way and fit it in somewhere in her own texture of life. Footnote: Professor Joshi, the leader of the new Chinese Renaissance movement, has written on the past Indianization of China. End of footnote. Even Buddhism and its intricate philosophy became tinged with the doctrines of Confucius and Lao Tse. The somewhat pessimistic outlook of Buddhist philosophy could not change or suppress the love of life and gaiety of the Chinese. There is an old Chinese proverb which says, if the government gets hold of you, they'll flog you to death; if the Buddhists get hold of you, they'll starve you to death. A famous Chinese novel of the 16th century, Monkey, by Wu Chen-en, translated into English by Arthur Waley, deals with the mythical and fantastic adventures of Sun Song on his way to India. The book ends with a dedication to India. I dedicate this work to Buddha's pure land. May it repay the kindness of patron and preceptor, may it mitigate the sufferings of the lost and damned. After being cut off from each other for many centuries, India and China were brought by some strange fate under the influence of the British East India Company. India had to endure this for long. In China the contact was brief, but even so it brought opium and war. And now the wheel of fate has turned full circle, and again India and China look towards each other, and past memories crowd in their minds. Again pilgrims of a new kind cross or fly over the mountains that separate them, bringing their messages of cheer and goodwill and creating fresh bonds of a friendship that will endure. End of Part 15, titled, India and China, of Chapter 5.